Next, today, we want to take a look at what we call midterm elections. So, we'll explain what these mean. We'll explain some of the different things that go on in a midterm election. But these are elections in America that get a lot less attention, even though they are just as important as the presidential elections in terms of the types of policies that get made. All right, so the first thing we want to understand, this is actually about election years where we have a presidential election, but we have what's called a coattail effect. Now, a coattail effect, this comes into play during presidential elections, and this describes the fact that when there's a strong candidate running for president, usually members of his or her party in Congress will benefit because voters will be motivated to go to the polls to vote for the presidential candidate and will tend to support the congressional candidate from that person's party. So, in a very strong presidential candidate will encourage new voters to come out, and they're most likely going to not just vote for president, but they're going to vote for everything on the ballot, and so that helps the congressional members in the presidential candidate's party. But the reverse is also true. A presidential candidate with a bad reputation may cause the congressman to try to distance themselves from the president. So when a president is becoming unpopular, candidates in their own party will try to campaign based on how different they are than the president of the United States. So we want to talk about coattail effects first, because the types of elections we're about to talk about will be elections that don't involve the president at all, and it's up to Congress on their own to attract voters. All right, so the elections we're talking about are what we call midterm elections. These take place, these are regular national elections for the House and the Senate, but they take place in the middle of a president's term. So they don't take place in an election year. So this is like the election in 2018, the election in 2014, the election in 2010, 2006. These all take place in the middle of a presidential term. So the congressmen don't benefit from having those presidential candidates get all sorts of attention on the election. Now, in every election, and this includes the midterm elections, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election. Remember, their terms are 2 years, so they have to run for re-election in every election. 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. So, which states are up with a senator kind of depends on the cycle, but there are about 33 Senate seats up for re-election in every election. Now, we mentioned the president is not running for election, but the president will get a lot of attention in this election. But there's not nearly as much attention as people pay to the presidential election. So there's less coverage, less people pay attention. We're going to find out that less people vote. But midterm elections decide control of Congress. So they decide which party controls the House and which party controls the Senate. And this often can and does change in the middle of a president's term. And then if the control of Congress change, it really changes the president's ability to pass policies that they want. So, what usually happens in a midterm election is that the party of the president will perform poorly. So, the president's party tends to lose seats in both the House and the Senate. You can see this in the chart on the right. If you see an orange bar, that represents the president's party losing seats. If you see a green bar, that represents the president's party gaining seats. And you can see that that is incredibly rare. And if they do gain seats, it is a very small gain. Those losses are big losses. Those are losses of 50 seats or even 60 seats under Barack Obama. When the president is not running, there's a lot less enthusiasm for the election and there's a lot less voter turnout. The other thing is that the party that doesn't have the president, they have an easier time getting their voters motivated. It's a lot easier to motivate voters when they're angry about who's in charge. When the voters are happy about what the government's doing, they're paying a lot less attention to the election. It's a lot harder to get them to show up and vote, to keep the good things going. But voters who are angry show up and vote. So the president's party in a midterm election, the president's party can often lose control of one or both houses of government. If we have the president from one party and part of Congress from another party, we call that divided government. And that means that it's going to be a lot more difficult for laws to get passed. So in a couple of the most recent midterm elections, we saw both huge losses for both President Obama and for President Trump in the first midterm elections that they faced. In 2010, this would be Barack Obama's first midterm election. Voters were so upset, especially Republican voters, upset that Obama had won the election, that the Republicans showed up and voted a ton, and Democrats were unmotivated to show up and vote. So Republicans gained 63 seats in the House. That means Barack Obama's party lost 63 seats, and they lost control of the House of Representatives. The Republicans lost 6 seats. I mean, the Republicans gained 6 seats in the Senate. The Democrats had a large Senate lead, so they maintained control of the Senate, but they lost 6 seats and took what was a big Senate majority to a very, very thin Senate majority. So Obama, after his first 2 years in office, faced divided government. Same thing for President Trump. In 2018, this was the first midterm election for President Trump, and Republicans lost control of the House. They lost 41 seats. Democratic voters were very motivated with President Trump in office, and Republican voters were not as motivated. And so Democratic voters showed up in huge numbers and gained 41 House seats and control of the House of Representatives. So President Trump also lost control of the government and faced divided government. In Trump's first midterm, the Republicans did gain Senate seats, and that has a lot to do with the states that were up for election. So you can see the different states on the Obama side and on the Trump side. So here we can look at voting turnout in all of the elections. So this gives us an election every other year. It shows the presidential elections and the midterm elections. You can see the presidential elections that turnout, those bars are high. Those bars tend to be around 60%, and the midterm election bars are much lower. They tend to be in the 40s or even as low as the 30s. In what we call the general election, that's when there's a president, more people vote. The voting base is diverse. There's all kinds of different people showing up and voting. There's, young people have been encouraged to vote. There's a lot of attention to the election. And so people know about the election. They turn out and vote. Generally, in recent history, when the turnout is higher, that favors Democrats, because the groups that support Democrats, like young voters and people in cities and stuff, those groups tend to show up less in the midterm election. In the midterm election, when the voter turnout is way down, the people that always vote are still voting. And so those elections tend to have more older voters, more rural voters, more white voters. And so lower turnout elections generally in recent history have favored the Republican Party. So in a midterm election, since the voting turnout is lower, that tends to help the Republican Party in their results for Congress, and it hurts the Democrats in their results for Congress in years without a presidential election. So this is something that the parties have to deal with and find a way to adjust to. All right, so that's the main things we need to know about midterm elections. Mainly, we want to make sure that we remember that the voting turnout is lower. We want to make sure we can explain why the voting turnout is lower. We want to make sure that we understand the different levels of attention paid to these races. And we need to understand that these are equally important to our presidential elections. You guys are going to be our informed voters in the future who will know how important the midterm elections are and how important they are to a president who's trying to influence policy.